Paul Kennedy has been the host of the very popular Ideas program since 1999 on CBC Radio, when he succeeded the legendary Lister Sinclair. Paul has a BA from Queen's University and an MLit from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He also did postgraduate work at the University of Toronto, where he worked with Marshall McLuhan. Paul has won national and international recognition for his work, including an ACTRA Award for Best Canadian Radio Documentary for a program called War on the Home Front, co-authored with Timothy Finley. He's also won from the B'nai B'rith Media Human Rights Award for a series called Nuremberg on Trial, an Armstrong Award presented by Columbia University. In 2005, he was awarded the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute Special Citation for Excellence in Ocean Sciences Journalism for his 8-part series, Learning from the Oceans. So, there's our moderator.
Thanks, John. I want to begin by saying that it's a real privilege to be here. I was also privileged to be invited 2 years ago to the first summit in Muskoka to broadcast some of that on Ideas, which turned out to be a very popular program. Also at a very important time. That summit was called because there was another summit happening only a week or so later in Muskoka. The first part of it happened in Muskoka at Huntsville. Second part, as you all know, called the G20, happened in Toronto. And it somewhat made our discussions on that occasion rather timely. And I think the discussions we've been having the last 2 days have been even more timely. That said, I want to apologize that I almost missed the beginning of this yesterday. I was actually in Vancouver on Monday, and so it was a sort of 3-hour time difference. I promised Judy that I would be here yesterday at 8 o'clock to do the kinds of things journalists are supposed to do. That means, you know, sipping coffee and trying to get deep background information, stories about geographical reality, scientific reality, ethical reality. I was supposed to be doing all that, except I woke up at 7:54, or 8:54, I mean, with 6 minutes to get here. Didn't quite make it. I got here in the middle of the singing, though, which was pretty good, I thought, proving that old guys can respond to crises and giving us some hope that maybe we can get ourselves out of this mess we're in right now. You know, but having almost missed the beginning of the Muskoka Summit on the end, I was really moved by what I've heard the last couple of days. Moved, in fact, almost to tears on a couple of occasions, because we are in a very, very difficult situation. And those of us who love the planet have to actually realize what we're dealing with here. These are big questions. I was moved to tears. Those are sort of sad tears when you consider what we've done on Earth, to Earth. There were also really happy tears, though, because I heard scientists doing something that I didn't think scientists were supposed to do, and that was being passionate about something. We have this image of science as dispassionate, arm's length, objective, and what I heard was scientists expressing not only the results of very powerful research, but also the results of very powerful feelings, feelings that they have for the planet we live on. And so I had sort of happy tears. The other cause of happiness, which I've expressed to several people in the audience over the past couple of days, was that I'm happy to see the people who are wearing black shirts in this room, because they have provided They asked, I think, some of the most probing questions. And for that reason, I want this panel discussion to move as quickly as possible to the floor so that we can hear more questions from the people rather than from me. So I'll just give you an indication of the format that I planned for this panel discussion. I will ask each of the panelists, and I'll do it in the order in which they spoke, I will ask each of the panelists a question sort of that came to me. It wasn't necessarily a question that evolves directly out of what they said, but it's something that I think might animate them. And on my business card, by the way, I'm called host animateur. The French-Canadian word for host is animateur. And so I want to animate them. I want to get them to, I suppose, show some of the passion that I heard when they were presenting their speeches over the past couple of days. That's my purpose in the first question. I will then ask one question for the entire panel, and they can choose to answer it or not to answer it. And after that, as quickly as possible, I will move to questions from the floor. It was announced yesterday, and it is true that this program will be going to air on Ideas next Wednesday. on June 13th. So that at 9:05, if you ask a question, you could hear it next week, sometime between 9:05 and 10 o'clock, or if you happen to be in Newfoundland. In fact, I am going to be in Newfoundland. But that's when the show will air. It will be available on the Ideas website, and we will provide links to the Summit's website as well, and encourage people to take part in the communique that you are all being asked to take part in as well. All those things being said, let me begin with the first question. And the question goes to Justina Ray, whose topic yesterday was losing biodiversity. Is it important if we don't see it? I was really quite impressed with Justina's presentation. I have my notes here. One of the things she did, which actually kicked off the conversation, and in some ways made it circular, because it's where we ended with most recently this morning with the presentation. She asked the question, how do we bring scientists and policymakers together? And as you know, that was almost specifically the topic of the final presentation today. I thought there was an elephant in the room when Justina was talking, because although she spoke very passionately about her topic, and she really sort of gave us the definitions and raised some of the most important questions, she didn't talk about caribou, which is the subject of her primary area of research. I'd like her to do that for just a few moments now, and bring it really full circle. Talk about how caribou relate to the questions of biodiversity that we've been discussing for the past 2 days.
Caribou is a species. It's one species. Its distribution is across the circumpolar, Arctic, and boreal regions of the world, and Canada has an enormous responsibility for its future. It also encompasses a great deal of diversity within the species. There are many, even though it is one species, there are many different kinds of caribou in terms of the way that they relate to their environments and how they behave and how they carry out their lives. Right now, they are confined mostly to the northern half of our country in boreal and Arctic systems, and they've lost ground in the southern boreal systems where they used to be, mostly because of the human footprint. And so they are an important symbol of kind of how we're going to do business in the future. And they've become that quite aptly because they are so sensitive to disturbance. They're not the winners when we come into their habitats, by and large. We haven't yet figured out entirely how to balance our economic aspirations with maintaining caribou on the landscape. And yet there is a good foundation of science that has been able to accumulate over the years that tells us some of what we need to be able to do in the future. And much of that is about restraining ourselves and about imposing some limits to our activities and to be able to use them as a means for being able to design better how we're going to be able to live together in the future, and hopefully to carry along their coattails, essentially, other lesser-known species that share the same habitats. And so how this is going to play out is going to be very, very important.
And it's good to have people like you watching, because you can provide us with some of the answers. Next question goes to Jeremy Kerr. And Jeremy also impressed me in his talk, which was about emerging threats and converging responses, challenges and opportunities for conservation in an era of global change. The take-home message I got from Jeremy was actually buried in the middle, but not buried because it hit me with like a ton of bricks, really. He said that ignoring real-world trends will not cause real-world trends to ignore you. And that's a message that I'm going to be pondering for quite a while, because I think it's something that could activate all of us in the way we deal with the world. Maybe I'm starting out here on a bit of an animal theme, but I'm going to ask Jeremy about butterflies. He seemed to be passionate. I think he called himself a geek yesterday when he was describing it, and he did get passionate. What fascinates me about the butterfly is that it is such a fragile animal. It is, the wings of a butterfly have to be some of the most beautiful but also temporary or fragile, disposable things in the world. And yet he seems to think that a butterfly can be a very powerful, not only a symbol, but a very powerful sort of lightning rod that can activate us. So I'd like to hear him talk about butterflies and what it means for his way of looking at biodiversity.
It's just wonderful to have the chance to talk about how tremendously powerful butterflies are for absolutely everything. They are, of course, my main research focus as a taxon, an assemblage of species, and they're an extremely powerful vehicle for us to gain insights into some of the implications of global change for biological diversity. The diversity of butterflies in Canada is reasonably high. We have just about 300 species that have been observed here, and increasingly it looks like that number will probably be increasing. It's only just yesterday that the Ottawa Citizen reported that the giant swallowtail butterfly is making its way north and has now been sighted in Ottawa for the very first time. This is Canada's biggest butterfly, and more Canadians will be seeing these amazing organisms in places that historically they were absent from. Now this observation touches on a couple of important points. One, butterflies are this amazing tool for global change research. They're very short-lived organisms, but they are also what we call thermophilic organisms. They really like warm weather. So if you go to tropical environments, you're going to find huge numbers of butterflies. Now what this means for us in places like Canada, where traditionally we think of ourselves as a very cold country, is that as we increase temperatures through the human contributions to climate change, these organisms which are heat-loving are making their way further and further north. They're no longer limited by the coldness of our winters. And so what we're seeing is these species which are citrus specialists, things that like lemon trees and lime trees, like giant swallowtails, making their way further and further north, and there's citrus relatives that they use in Canada. So that's one aspect of butterflies that is really powerful for us in science. They provide us with these global change insights. But another aspect to butterflies, another characteristic of this group, which fascinates me but makes me love them all the more at the same time, is that they are such powerful vehicles for us to communicate to the public. It is not hard to convince people to love incredibly beautiful things. Sometimes what we have to do as scientists is just give people the chance to unleash their interest, to kind of let that passion go and to really engage with groups of organisms that are amenable to rapid study, that can be identified fairly quickly. And you can engage large numbers of people fairly quickly by using groups like butterflies, because they speak to so many of us. But what's interesting about them is that the voice they use to communicate to the general public is backed up by a great correlation with the processes that are shaping the trends in biodiversity for so many other groups. So what happens to butterflies is a useful indicator for what happens to many other groups of species. And so we can use butterflies to communicate to the general public, but we can also use their capacity to indicate what's going on with other groups of organisms as a means to cast that net even broader, even though the vehicle for our communications is just with butterflies. And then we can expand that to other groups as well. But they are this powerful vehicle, both for public communication, but also in terms of the potential insights to be gained from them in global research. There's only one other thing that I'd say about butterflies, and that is that if they were not a wonderful group for global change research, if they were not an incredibly powerful tool for public relations, I would still love taking pictures of them. And I would still love going to new places to see the distinct butterfly faunas that you find in those different regions around the world.
The next question is for Andrew Gonzalez, whose talk yesterday was Biodiversity Science for Global Environmental Change. It was an amazing talk. I was also privileged, as was everyone in the room, to know that it had been basically embargoed until an hour before it was delivered here, because it was published yesterday, I believe, in Nature. What was amazing about it was that he brought home really clearly that, having looked at all the research over, I think, the past 3 decades, he came to the conclusion, he and his co-authors came to the conclusion, that biodiversity is actually much more important than any of the other factors that we've been considering and becoming depressed about in the past. And so it really brought that home. I thought, since we're on an animal theme, I might ask him to talk about yeast, but Baker's yeast. Then I thought, no, he was virtually involved in a genocide on that topic. His research killed an awful lot of yeast. And so rather than do that, I'm going to ask him to talk about actually the last slide that he put up during his presentation, which was a picture of his new baby daughter. And I would like him to talk about whether the fact that she is now in this earth, on this earth, affects in any way the way he looks at the science he does in biodiversity and the way he thinks the world should perhaps be going.
If you could cut the bit about yeast genocide out, that would be great. No, we did rescue a lot of yeast. We helped them to help themselves. Yeast Anonymous. Sorry, no, much more important. To Charlotte, who was born just over a year ago, and Jeremy and I were talking yesterday on the way back in the car, just marveling at the day that we'd experienced and the exchange that we had with you all, and how eloquently questions were posed, and despite the importance of the questions, that we felt that there was reason for optimism. And I don't think my wife and I would have brought Charlotte into this world if there wasn't reason for optimism. And if I didn't feel that we had enough time to do something about it for our children. I presented one graph that projected a scenario of extinction rates over the next century. And Charlotte will live through this century. She will be my age when that red line reaches its peak. If you remember, that was 2050, when potentially we will be at 500,000 extinctions per decade. And it'll be a very different world. And if Tom Lovejoy's data are correct, it'll be a world that'll be at least, we'll see sea levels at 6 to 8 meters higher than they are today. So that's petrifying, because the scale of the response, it has to be global. But at the risk of using a well-worn cliche, the only way we can think global is to act locally. And this is an incredibly important point. It's true that we're in a biosphere. It's an Earth system, and we have to manage an Earth system. But extinction and biodiversity loss is a local phenomenon. When I mean local, I don't mean just here in the town of Muskoka. I mean it's at the scale of human landscapes. It's at the scale at which we interact with nature. And so what I like to think of it more as a pan-regional thing, right? They're the same processes, the same scientific issues. The socio-ecological dynamics are going on at landscape scales. They're probably the same problems everywhere, but they're slightly different. They have a local context. And so what I'm looking for Charlotte, are the tools with which she can use, her generation can use, to solve these problems. I'm a great believer in doing this sort of transdisciplinary science where we bring in the social dimension and the ecological dimension, make it work together, so that we can act locally in an intelligent and adaptive way. So I'm from London, from the UK. I've lived in Paris. I came to Montreal in 2003, and very quickly I realized that Quebec was a special place, that Montreal was a special place. We just hired something like 50 biodiversity scientists, if you look across the 8 universities, and I realized there was an incredible potential to enhance that science and to use that science and to engage the public. So I was looking for a project, and it was when this green belt came up, and the idea of using ecological science and biodiversity science to reconnect the landscape around Montreal, reconnect it to the south, to the United States, that'll help the butterflies move north, find their habitat in the north, for Jeremy's sake and his children's sake, but to connect Montreal and to the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is such an important freshwater ecosystem, again, to reconnect it. And so I feel that by setting that in motion, I'm going to improve her life, her quality of life. By acting locally, we can deal with this global problem. And what I hope is that Montreal will become, that corridor network will become a template for action in many different cities around the world, because essentially we'll all be living in cities over the next century. And so we've got to bring nature to people, right? It's coming back to this notion of biophilia and being connected to nature. We can't, it's right that we have these high density conurbations, but we can't exclude ourselves from nature. We have to bring that in and make these cities living ecosystems. So I hope for Charlotte, that she's Canadian, she's a Quebecer, and she'll probably stay here all her life, and I hope that the science that we do, the biodiversity science we're doing now, will provide the next generation with the tools to live sustainably.
Stephen Monet's talk yesterday was called Living Landscape, Greater Sudbury's Biodiversity Action Plan. And I have to say that my memory of Sudbury, and I travel a lot in Canada, but I haven't been to Sudbury a lot, plainly. It was the images that showed up on the screen from the past that I recall of Sudbury. That was the sort of surface of the moon, black rock, nothing living, everything dead. And it was both enlightening and thrilling and exciting to see what has been accomplished there in terms of bringing back things that we probably thought were gone forever. One thing that stuck with me through his talk was actually a quotation that he put up. It's interesting, many people quoted Einstein, who some people could probably blame for some of the problems we're in now. But Einstein plainly had different ways of looking at the world, and the quotation that I love that Stephen used was, "The environment is everything that isn't me." I want Stephen to talk about whippoorwills.
Whippoorwills for us represent an organism that is the simplest possible organism in order to make a contact with the general public. So it was this, as I described it, a foot in the door species that if you can if you can make a contact with the community to help, not for the sake of necessarily learning where the whippoorwills are in Sudbury. Sudbury's a great place for whippoorwills because they love these second growth forests, ones that are regenerating. And that's what we have in much of the impacted area, that 81,000 hectares. So we know that there's a lot of whippoorwills in the general vicinity of Greater Sudbury, albeit they're threatened in Ontario. But they represent this organism that, and we really racked our brains trying to think, how can we possibly, what organism can we use that people could not possibly get wrong, and that they could, from that we could get a name, we can get a phone number, and we could possibly get them involved in additional natural history surveys like Project Feeder Watch or upcoming the e-Butterfly project, which is a great project that we'll hope to develop some specific initiatives around. But it came out that the whippoorwill, and from that we did get that 145 calls. People were very excited calling, "I have a whippoorwill." It's been calling for a number of years, or "It's driving me crazy," which was a lot of the calls that we received. "Can we make that thing shut up?" But and that's what the whippoorwill essentially represents for us. Is it's this very it's a species that allows us to make a contact with the community, which is extremely important in order to get people engaged and involved in wanting more, to learn more. The one thing I want to say also is that people, there's almost an innate desire to share something, but they don't have a means. Who's interested in that anyways? So I think once you tap into that, you say, wow, somebody's interested in whippoorwills. They are actually interested. They're going to do something with that information that I provide them. And we want to make sure that we do something with the data they provide for us, but also with additional projects that they might become involved. And I think if you tap into that, there's a lot of people out there willing to share things like on their bird feeders. Project Feeder Watch, great thing. People talk about that, but they don't know that somebody else cares or wants to do something with that information.
And Steve Hounsell's topic yesterday was Ontario's biodiversity strategy, protecting what sustains us. I have a national show, and quite frequently audiences outside Ontario don't like to hear about Ontario. But I was quite happy to hear that some good things are happening in this province. Because my radio audience wasn't here yesterday, they didn't get to hear Steve's discussion of hippos. And so I'd like him to talk about hippos.
Well, fair enough. I believe hippo, I think it actually came from Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson from Harvard University, just summarizing what he and many others consider to be the key threats to biodiversity. And of course, it's simply an acronym which helps people remember what it is. And again, habitat loss still, whether it's here, whether you're talking globally, habitat loss and the fragmentation of habitat still remains the #1 threat to biodiversity. And it's certainly relevant to southern Ontario. It's certainly relevant to the southern, more settled landscapes of Canada and everywhere else. Without habitat, there's no home. Species simply cannot flourish. They do not have enough home, if you will, to be able to survive and populate. The invasive species has become a huge problem. And again, it's interesting, we talk about invasive species. We actually never look in the mirror when we talk about that term. I hope you get my meaning. We are in, every continent, save Antarctica, and even there, we probably are having some issues. We ourselves are a huge vector for many of the invasive species, and we have caused probably more damage than any other single invasive species. But nevertheless, having said that, without a doubt, it is a huge problem within Ontario's and Canada's and global biodiversity. Pollution, still a problem. We still have legacy issues. We still have bioaccumulation. Some of these pollutants are spreading worldwide and are being found in places in the high Arctic and top-level predators where you would never anticipate them. We still have a long ways to go. The underlying root cause, of course, being population growth. There's 7 billion of us on this planet, and we are still growing, and we all aspire to lives similar to what we have. I talked about Ontario's ecological footprint. If everybody lived the way we live, which is I guess I could say, talk about hippo, we are metaphorical pigs, if you will. It would take the resources of 4 planets. We only have 1. That isn't possible. We have to ratchet it down and redefine what we consider quality of life in a very different way than what we have in terms of material wealth. Overharvesting, still a huge issue globally. Less so here, but it's still a problem. Globally, it's been a huge issue. Collapse of global fisheries, one after another. A big problem. And then there's climate change. And again, that's all the issues we've talked about, and others have mentioned it, and even I believe Tom Lovejoy mentioned it last night as well. The global problems we have with biodiversity happen without climate change. Climate change now is going to totally transform the Earth. In fact, I would say that the Earth, I would agree with James Hansen, the Earth as we know it will no longer exist in the 21st century. In fact, Bill McKibben just wrote an excellent little book called Earth with 2 A's, meaning it's a different Earth, and we need to prepare for that. Climate change is going to cause dramatic changes, and at a pace much quicker than most species can adapt. There will be major disjuncts. There will be major collapses. There will be losers, and there will be some winners. The winners, more than likely, will be the opportunistic species and some of the invasive species. It will be a homogenization, a simplification of the Earth's ecosystems. We need to act. We need to act very, very quickly. That's why I transformed hippo into chippo. I think climate change is emerging as the big issue, which is interconnected with biodiversity in terms of cause and effect. Tom Lovejoy mentioned that yesterday, as well as in terms of solutions. We need to make this a century of restoration, investing heavily in reconnecting landscapes so that they are more resilient, so that they can assist natural migration and use the power of photosynthesis to suck up that carbon while we are enhancing the resiliency of natural ecosystems to sustain biodiversity.
And the final talk this morning from Karen Kraft-Sloan was the science policy nexus, making public policy as if biodiversity mattered. The only animal I can think of asking Karen about is an animal that she's very capable of talking about because she is one, or once was one, and that is a politician. She actually said some very courageous things for a person coming from that perspective. She said that we need to change the nature of the politicians that we elect in order to have some serious effect trying to solve the natural or nature problems that we've got ourselves into. So I would like Karen to talk about, I guess, do a comparative study of politicians now and the politicians that she'd like to see.
To be honest with you, the people that we send to Ottawa are ourselves. When you put a lawn sign up, when you agree to run for political office, and if you happen to be elected, and that's what I told my friends and family, it's not if the problem isn't going into the nomination and winning the nomination and then moving on as the local candidate. The problem is if I win. And can you handle that? Can I handle that? But you don't change. Or at least you can try not to change too much. And when I went to Ottawa, I identified 3 areas that I wanted to commit myself to, and I had a pretty good idea of the things that I stood for. And what happens when you're in that place is that you have a lot of pressure. You can't possibly know every piece of legislation that you're voting for, and I will admit to you wholeheartedly here that I'm sure that I stood in the House and voted for the wrong things. But I always said that on the things that you know, you have to vote the way your conscience dictates. And it's not always easy to do that. So you have to prepare yourself before you go on that journey. You have to prepare yourself and be really clear about who you are. Because as I said, the pressure is incredible. You have pressure from the fact that there is so much going on. It's so complex and technical. The devil is in the details. When we amended the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, there was about 800 amendments to the act because it was so badly flawed. And there was 3 iterations of the bill, as I mentioned. I had about 200 amendments myself. So you can imagine what it was like preparing to go into committee every day to be able to argue that the semicolon before the not should be placed after the period of the hyphen in clause subset 457, da-da-da-da. So you can imagine what it was all about. So in order to ensure that we have the right kind of people going to Ottawa, first of all, I think you have to look at what some of the systemic barriers are for people that you want in Ottawa representing you. People don't understand political parties. A lot of my constituents thought, oh, well, they just wrote you out all kinds of checks and covered your campaign and they provided you with campaign party workers, and you're going, excuse me? Candidates have to raise their own money. They have to find their own volunteers. The first year that I went, I had a huge riding. I was $26,000 in debt. It was a 60-day campaign. We had more smoke and mirrors than we had campaign volunteers. The second time it was easier. The third time it was very easy. There was a lot of people knew me, and I had volunteers from all over the GTA coming to help because they wanted an environmentalist to go back to Ottawa. So first of all, you have to remove the veil of what it's like to participate in the political process. Secondly, a lot of my friends just thought politics was incredibly tacky. Why would I ever want to get involved with something like that? Well, if you care about your children or your grandchildren, if you care about the air that you breathe, if you care about a social safety net, if you care about the dignity of older people, then you should be involved in the political process. We have to make, they've been muddling around with campaign financing. I think the move that they made has been an appropriate move, but now they're going to take those monies away. So it's going to make it even more difficult for average Canadians to run. We were a typical family, typical Canadian family. We didn't have, we were fairly young. We didn't have a lot of assets. You can go into a lot of debt if you don't have that kind of support. You have to find ways to support women in politics. You have to support people from non-traditional areas. The other thing is, a lot of people don't like to be under the microscope. I was called a whore in the local newspaper because of the way I voted, and I had a 16-year-old child reading that newspaper, if you can imagine what that's like. So a lot of people don't want to do that sort of thing. And for people who work in the science and research community, they don't necessarily want to put themselves under that. So you have to help people. You have to mentor them. You have to be able to encourage those candidates within our political system and the structures that we have to be the nominated candidate, to go forward. That if you have a friend who wants to run for political office, you have to help them because they need your help. They're not just going to Ottawa. They're bringing all of us to Ottawa with them, and we have to help them. And I think we also have to help Canadians better understand, as I said earlier, to have a role about evidence-based policy making and why it's really important to have 20-year-olds in the House of Commons and 80-year-olds in the House of Commons, to have scientists and researchers and teachers and lawyers and all kinds of folks. And when they're there, they need support as well. As I mentioned, there were only 4 of us out of 306 that had staff that actually knew what we were talking about when we went to Environment Committee.
I'll throw out one question now, which I guess comes from the host of a program called Ideas. It's a bit of a big question, and it's something that I won't say has been bothering me because I've had a wonderful time over the last 2 days listening to these people talk, but in some ways it's a smaller version of the issue that Steve raised, and that is that we have to also consider ourselves as an invasive species. We are, in some sense, the problem. And narrowing in on that somewhat, in some ways scientists have been the problem. There's been a sort of anthropomorphic view of the world in which we think we have all the power and we can change things, and all the changes we make will be better. And all of us have plenty of evidence that that's not actually always the case. I wonder, since the panel is full of scientists, whether as scientists they're ever entertaining those kinds of misgiving thoughts about maybe what we do might not actually do what we think it's going to do. Maybe it might cause more harm than help, as so much science has done at various points in the past. I throw it out to anybody who wants to answer it, and after that we'll be going directly to questions from the floor.
As the non-scientist on the panel, I'll weigh in, and I absolutely agree with you, and I think that's one of the reasons why I presented this idea of new forms of science, which might have been a little technical and dry, but I think as I said earlier, it's really important to respect the disciplines and understand where we've come from, but also when we're looking at these big, huge, massive global environmental change problems, we have to understand that there are new perspectives, and there are perspectives that come into the creation of knowledge and sharing knowledge and the co-production of knowledge and other ways of knowing. That's important, but also understanding that there is the knowledge base, and then there is people who share in the problem and are affected by it and are affected by the solutions, and so they need to be brought into the process. You can't take a look at science in an acritical way.
Oh, sorry. Go for Steve.
An interesting question, and it also brings to mind some words from James Lovelock, who is a brilliant global scientist who looks at planetary systems. And his comment, I'll answer it 2 ways. His comment very much resonates, I think, with what you said. The bottom line is, He feels we're simply not intelligent enough to be able to, understand and manage the planet in a way that we might like to think we can manage. And his more pessimistic, however, I don't believe he's being pessimistic. I think his sense of realism is that he hopes that enough will be able to survive over the next couple of centuries such that evolution will in fact create a new humanity that does have the intellect to be able to better survive and better manage in this planet. Having said that, I think we have no choice but to, in effect, become planetary managers. We are now, as we have heard, in the Anthropocene. We have the capacity, and we have demonstrated the capacity to impact entire planetary Earth living systems. We are witnessing it through biodiversity loss. We are witnessing it now through changing of climates because of anthropogenic effects. So we have no choice but to enter that and to be as smart and as adaptive, meaning adaptive management, as we possibly can. I think we need to simplify with the complexities of which we convey some of these things as such that it becomes so burdensome that it makes it almost impossible to deal with. I think we need to focus, simplify the big issues, and start to act. And I think if we do that, we might actually get through the bottleneck of our own making with most of life intact and hopefully much of humanity intact. But I think it is that grave, and I think we have little choice but to do the very best that we can. And by the way, I think at high level we do have many of the solutions probably in hand. What we do not have, in my view, is the public support and hence the political will and the business drive to move us from where we are to a more ecologically sustainable and hence socially sustainable future.
Yeah, I've heard a couple of things that are of some concern as a scientist. One of them has been the call for a conversation about science in Canada. I think that it can be extended to the rest of North America and the rest of the planet. Probably there's been a build-up of mistrust in science. I'm not sure why that is, but there's no doubt that scientists are partly to blame. There has been a tendency to stay in the ivory tower. I quite like this idea of an ivory tower image, that we sort of run up to the top of the tower, close the door and lock all the doors and stay in the clouds. And many of the scientists in my generation, of our cohort, feel that that's got to change. That it's true that we spend a lot of our time thinking about esoteric things. We sometimes hide behind our jargon because we understand it, it's protected, and we can communicate with each other. But the bottom line is, you don't know if you truly understand something if you can't communicate it to everybody. You can't communicate it to your mother, to your children. And that's our responsibility, I think, is to do that, is to come out of the ivory tower. And although we're not trained to communicate, and we're learning how to communicate, we need to do that, because the problem is so vast that it's not going to be solved by engineers or by scientists alone. So that's the first point, is that scientists have to learn to communicate, and there are many programs put in place now for helping scientists to do that. And whenever I've engaged, and when I've gone to Quebec City or gone to Ottawa to engage, I've always been bowled over by how receptive people are, politicians, decision makers, the public at large, when you try to communicate the issues. The second point I want to make is that science is about creating knowledge. I would say there are very few deeply bad scientists. Science is not evil. It's about creating a culture of understanding and about the curiosity of life on Earth and life in the universe. What you do with that knowledge afterwards is a responsibility of everybody.
That's the problem. Yeah.
And so that's where the problem lies. Now, there's probably a spectrum sitting on this table about how much we think we can act responsibly by tinkering with a global system or even a regional system like a landscape. I'm not saying we're ready to tinker with a global system, but we do have to be using the science. We have enough knowledge now to act responsibly. There's enough science in there. I think scientists should be engaged in that process. Scientists shouldn't be leading that process. It's a democratic decision what we do with that science. But there's enough science there that we can act for biodiversity change right now, today. And I hope that we as scientists can rebuild the public trust in what we're doing.
Justina.
uncertainty is a very critical part of science. In fact, scientists strive to answer questions, to get more and more precise about how their conclusions come out. There's always going to be some level of uncertainty. You can't get around that. And scientists are trained to communicate about that uncertainty and emphasize that in some cases. You know, it is this, but, you know, there's this caveat and that caveat. And that can be very confusing in terms of communications. And it clashes with policymaking to some extent, because although most members of the public assume and want policy to be well-founded on the best available science, and most policymakers will say that it is, or that it was meant to be. The bringing together of the science and the policymaking is not often an elegant exercise. And with particular, I mean, you may not have a science that's designed to answer the question. Law is sort of either on this side or that side. It's not usually designed to embrace that uncertainty and to figure out how to adapt and change and sort of be nimble with respect to how the policy is going to be actually implemented. And so these things are very, very difficult. And one of the unfortunate consequences of this is that there's a lot of burden of proof on science to be certain, more certain than we can be, and more certain than we should be, given trends that are out there that are difficult to ignore. And so you're waiting for that uncertainty, but that gives you license as a policymaker often to ignore those trends until that certainty comes. And that's the condition that we're in right now, the situation that we're in right now, where too often you're asking for that exact answer and Rome is burning. And so we have to be a little bit more careful with how we deal with that uncertainty, how we adapt to it as policymakers, but then also how we can make really the best use of what available information there is.
In a kind of deeply held way, it's in many respects what scientists get into science to do. The perception from ages past is that science ends with discovery and its communication to scientific colleagues. That's our objective. That's the thing we are rewarded to do. And the more impressive your discoveries can be and the more frequently you can publish, the better quality those publications are, the more accomplished you are as a scientist, and you'll do very well as a career person in that area. I think the question for us as scientists is partly whether or not we will choose to take responsibility for those discoveries as they are turned loose on an unsuspecting public. Sometimes discoveries are risky things, and they can yield benefits to society, but sometimes those benefits are in the short term. And we are missing the kind of long-term understanding of the implications of releasing those technologies into the world. A classic example, and one that was spoken to yesterday very clearly and eloquently, was the use of DDT in the 50s and the 1960s. And the implications in terms of conservation of unleashing this technology was that we lost songbirds, we lost our raptors across enormous tracts of the world in relatively short order. It created a real mystery for us. Scientists had made a number of measurements which in good faith they thought indicated meant this chemical was not going to be dangerous, and they were wrong. They had not yet thought through the longer term implications of releasing those new technologies into the world. And what we see today is that many of these technologies continue to be turned loose for the purposes of increasing the rate. I have to go to phys ed now. Many of these technologies are turned loose into the world for the purpose of increasing the rate at which we can extract resources, without a matching technology that will help us address some of the longer term implications of that rapid extraction of resources. So we're missing part of the equation. And one of the things that's been difficult for us as people in science is that these incentives, these rewards for people who do good things in their careers, tend to keep us locked up in the ivory tower, as Professor Gonzalez has said. And it's true that many scientists, you probably want to keep them locked up in the ivory tower. They're really better off there, and so are the rest of us. But in many instances, scientists care enough and have the tools to communicate effectively enough with the general public that they can at least open the windows a little bit on that tower and start speaking to a more general audience about the implications of the use of science. And that's something that we need to do better. And part of the solution to this is removing disincentives to engage in a public discussion about science, or from my point of view, about conservation. The other point that was raised, and I think this is really important, is the suspicion that scientists do this because what we're really trying to do is get more funding so we can go back and lock ourselves up in the ivory tower. And sorry, I let the cat out of the bag. It's really important to understand that when we talk about the need for sustainability, as we spoke about it 20 years ago, this inspired, that first Rio meeting inspired many of us to become scientists. And it was clear at that time that we knew enough to achieve sustainable development goals, to achieve a sustainable society. We didn't need 20 more years of research to give us the basic mechanisms to accomplish those goals. So when scientists engage in the sustainability discussion with society, we're not asking for more research. We're not asking for more funding for science. That's not the chief obstacle to achieving these objectives. And these are some of the ideas that many of us hold very near and dear to our hearts, and I think it's really important to understand that scientists must engage with the public to try to bring a better conversation to the forefront of these important debates in our time.
I approach this as a scientist, but also as a manager of a program, basically, that I've been entrusted with. So it's a long-running program. I will be, entrusted with it during this period of time. Somebody will take over when I'm gone, retired. And so, from a pragmatic standpoint, what we've tried to do, and I like the adaptive management that Steve mentioned, because that's really what we can in some instances turn on a dime. We heard from we have a Living with Lakes Center that studies aquatic systems. There's Norm Yan in the audience and John Gunn, who isn't here today, but they've been working on a project dealing with dissolved organic carbon and the importance of those in aquatic systems. And basically what we heard from them is, can you possibly start reconstructing the forest closer to the edge of the lakes, so within a 100 meter or 200 meter band? And so we essentially readjusted our program, not that we weren't doing planting in those areas, but we've emphasized planting in those areas. So we want to essentially turn on a dime and listen to the scientists and rapidly respond to that as a management. And something else comes along the way in the future, whether it's the species that we plant, and we're always trying to stay ahead, as I mentioned yesterday, with climate change, we will be able to do that. I'm somewhat of a student of information, having done a doctorate in biology and planning, but it was dealing with the design of an information system. And looking at the continuum from data, information, knowledge, we're very good at that as humans. We're designed to assimilate data. That's what we do. That's why I like the Einstein quote of "the environment is everything that isn't me," because we know when we're in a space, we're cold, we're hot, we're hungry, we're thirsty. We've been designed to respond and to have capacity to things that we always have a need. There's a need to be met. What we haven't been good at is learning we don't have a switch that tells us when enough is enough. We have a switch that says we don't have enough, sort of like I'm hungry or I'm thirsty. But we don't have, when our needs are met in overabundance and then some, we don't have a switch that says my needs are met, now it's time to turn off. And I think that the juxtaposition of that as a species to the implications that has is a very important one. And again, to close the loop on that continuum from data, which we're very good at, at creating information from that data, and building a knowledge base from that. What we aren't good at is the final step in that continuum, which is wisdom. And some primitive societies have been very good at that final step. My dad used to just shake his head when he'd see a large house being built with all the windows facing north, and he said, you know what, primitive society, primitive people knew better than to build houses like that. And yet we haven't, with all of our knowledge, we somehow have missed that point. So again, we've paid a lot of lip service to wisdom. It's almost a trite joke, oh yeah, it's wise to do that. But in fact, it's the most important and final conclusion to that, all of that, the three other steps before it.